Hi everyone. As a Syrian nationalist and a Muslim immigrant to Australia, I'd like to offer my perspective on the horrific Christchurch terrorist attack where 50 innocent men, women and children were killed. The man behind it was a terrorist, not a shooter or an assassin or an angelic blonde boy as the Murdoch press labelled him, but a terrorist. It's easy to dismiss the terrorist as just a deranged lunatic, but his actions are a product of our time. This is why I think it's important to discuss how we got to where we are now, with the entire world, from the Middle East to Australia, in a cyclone of hate and destruction. The cycle started with the actions of governments, not people, though the media is trying to lay the blame on white people to keep the divisiveness going. It's like saying Muslims are to blame for ISIS. What if you're white and Muslim? Are you to blame or not to blame? Or is it like a Schrodinger's cat situation? The murderer may have claimed to have white race nationalism ideas, but Muslims are only 1% of New Zealand's population. 20% are actually Polynesian. The original inhabitants, the Maori, were never actually genocided, but willingly voted to join the British Empire. So the hypocrisy of talking about population replacement in this context is mind-boggling. It's a deflection. It's not about race. It's about hatred of Muslims. The media and government should be blaming themselves. They've always been divisive. It's governments that fan the flames of hatred towards Muslims to gain support for their wars in the Middle East, while at the same time supporting terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS. These wars, and the terrorist groups that the US armed, killed more Muslims than the Christchurch terrorist ever could. The CIA created Al-Qaeda to push the Soviet Union out of Afghanistan. They used 9/11 to launch a war on Afghanistan, and the secular, non-religious state of Iraq fanned the flames of sectarian war to divide and conquer them, which led to the birth of ISIS. They didn't stop there. They armed Al-Qaeda in Libya, which hoisted a Al-Qaeda flag over a Libyan courthouse after the fall of Gaddafi, and they continue to arm Al-Qaeda and support it in Syria to this day. Wars and terrorism that created millions of refugees, and some of the people that died at Christchurch were Syrian and Iraqi, who would have been in their own countries if it were not for the US-backed terrorism and Israeli colonization. What an injustice it is that the terrorists blamed Muslims for terrorist attacks when it has been Muslims, like the Syrian army, who fought ISIS and Al-Qaeda on behalf of the world. The politicians and establishment media who are crying crocodile tears over the Christchurch mosque shooting are just as bad as the terrorists behind it. They are nation destroyers. To hear Clinton, Obama and Trump and all these Australian politicians feigning sympathy is outrageous. The Prime Minister of New Zealand said New Zealand is no place for violence like the terror attacks. She means the place for violence is Syria, where she accepted the US attack on the Syrian army while it was in the midst of fighting Al-Qaeda. Even Madeleine Albright, who said killing 500,000 Iraqi babies was worth it, feigned sympathy for 50 dead Muslims. Even Netanyahu, who is actively bombing mosques and ethnically cleansing both Christians and Muslim Palestinians, cried crocodile tears for this attack. Their hypocrisy is vomit-inducing. Especially knowing that Israel engineered the entire scenario we are in now via the Oded-Yunon plan. Israel was caught giving weapons to ISIS and Al-Qaeda in Syria by the United Nations. They admitted that they were providing medical aid to Al-Qaeda and arming insurgents in Syria. They said they preferred an ISIS victory, and now they want to claim that they're against terrorism? Even left liberals and first world Muslims like Ilhan Omar are guilty of this bias. She claims to oppose AIPAC and says she has sympathy for the mosque attack, but then tweets support for the Al-Qaeda-linked Syrian insurgency. Left liberals like Ocasio-Cortez wrote a tweet listing places where terrorist attacks occurred, and none of them were in countries that have suffered the most terrorism than any other country in the world: Palestine, Iraq and Syria. Liberals preach inclusivity of immigrants into the West while actively calling for humanitarian wars. Why do you think that is? Because they see moving to the West as some kind of transcendence into humanity. The media has been ignoring terrorist attacks in Syria for 8 years, including the beheading of a 12-year-old boy, not by Al-Qaeda or ISIS, but by one of the US vetted and armed groups. They ignored attacks like the twin car bombs at the primary school. The bombing of a bus that killed 200 civilians was called a hiccup by CNN. When Time magazine journalist filmed the beheading of a Syrian soldier, he didn't get censored, he got an award for Best Picture. The world didn't send their condolences after the attacks in Syria. The Eiffel Tower didn't turn off, because Western governments have been backing the terrorists that did them. The media is also responsible for creating the situation that led to the terrorist attack in Christchurch. They simultaneously fanned the hatred for Muslims to promote their regime change wars, then called for accepting the refugees caused by these wars. Rupert Murdoch's press wrote hundreds of articles drumming up the hate, calling for war, and then crying crocodile tears over the refugees the wars create. Sometimes within the same article. Like this one about the Syrian Kurdish refugee baby that drowned in Turkey with bombed Syria for Iran. Rupert Murdoch has a stake in Genie Energy, a company trying to steal oil out of the Syrian Golan Heights, which Israel illegally occupies. Hypocrites and terrorist sympathizers like Queensland Senator Fraser Anning complain about population replacement while supporting Israel's replacement of Christians and Muslim Palestinians and Syrians. His statement on the Christchurch attack called Islam a violent religion, unlike any other, while he quoted biblical scripture to legitimize an attack that killed babies. He writes, "Those who live by the sword die by the sword." I don't think this 3-year-old victim lived by the sword, but Fraser Anning certainly does. The party he belongs to, One Nation, say they have Judeo-Christian values. Its leader wore a burqa to parliament. I think someone doesn't realize Christianity is also a Middle Eastern religion, and that the Bible tells women to cover their hair too. Back to Fraser Anning's writing. It struck me more that he described the terrorist attack as an act of vigilantism, meaning it was the public taking justice into their own hands in place of the state, which means that he believes the state should be killing Muslims, and that is actually exactly what the state does. And that's where I think the condemnation of Fraser Anning by other politicians is hypocritical. They may not agree with his position on immigration, but they certainly agree that killing Muslims is strictly an activity for the state and its military. They're happy to slaughter millions of Muslims and Christians in the Middle East, as well as fund terrorism there, if it suits their regime change agenda. So Fraser Anning is not the only terror sympathizer in Parliament, and I'm not just talking about Pauline Hanson. So please, spare us your self-righteous hypocrisy. During the last terror attack in Australia, when an ISIS sympathizer held up a chocolate factory, I filmed a similar video discussing who was responsible. In it, I said ultimately, we are the ones responsible for the world we live in. And the same is true today.